1942, North Africa. The desert air shimmered above the scorched earth as Captain James "Jimmy" Mitchell squinted through his binoculars. Three German Panzer IIIs approached from the east, their long barrels scanning for targets. Jimmy's heart pounded against his ribcage, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. 5 Sherman tanks under his command, 20 men whose lives depended on his next decision. The letter from his father, worn from countless readings, burned in his breast pocket. War isn't about having the best weapons, his father had written. It's about having the best men. Today, that theory would be tested. All tanks, this is Hammer 1, Jimmy spoke into his radio. Remember your training, remember Detroit, remember what we're fighting for. 5 acknowledgments crackled through the speaker. Jimmy gave the order. Advance. Chapter 1, American Steel. Fort Knox, Kentucky, 3 years earlier, 1939. The morning sun glinted off the metal hulls of the training tanks as Second Lieutenant James Mitchell stood at attention beside his commanding officer, Colonel William Graves. At 65, Graves was a living relic, a cavalry officer who'd reluctantly exchanged his horse for mechanized armor. His weathered face had seen the trenches of the Great War, and his eyes harbored the ghosts of fallen comrades. These are the future, Mitchell, Graves said, gesturing toward the M2 medium tanks lumbering across the training field, though God knows I missed the smell of horsehair and leather. Jimmy nodded respectfully. At 39, he was considered old for a junior officer, but his background had earned him this position. Son of a World War I veteran, grandson of one of Henry Ford's original engineers, Jimmy had motor oil in his veins and strategy in his bones. German panzers are rolling through Poland as we speak, sir, Jimmy replied. Reports say they're faster, better coordinated than anything we've seen before. Graves scoffed. European problems. The Atlantic is wide, Lieutenant. With respect, sir, oceans aren't as wide as they used to be. The training exercise continued below them. The M2 medium tank was America's first real attempt at a battle tank, with its 37mm main gun and multiple machine guns positioned around the hull. It looked impressive on paper, but Jimmy had studied the reports coming from Europe. He knew better. Too many guns, not enough focus, Jimmy muttered. Speak up, Lieutenant. The Germans have concentrated their firepower, sir. One main gun, expertly aimed. We've scattered machine guns everywhere like buckshot, hoping something hits. Colonel Graves bristled. That tank was designed by the finest minds in the Army Ordnance Department. Yes, sir, but with respect, those minds haven't been on a battlefield where tanks are the primary weapon. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Major Robert Patton, a distant relative of the famous tank commander. At 45, Patton carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew the future of warfare better than his superiors. Graves, Mitchell. Patton nodded to both men. Just got word from Washington. They want a complete reevaluation of our armor doctrine in light of the German advances. Graves straightened his already rigid spine. Our doctrine is sound. The Germans are using their tanks differently, Patton countered. They're concentrating armor into fast-moving spearheads, supported by aircraft. They're not just supporting infantry, they're the main striking force. Jimmy felt a surge of validation. Like cavalry, sir, mobile, aggressive, concentrated force. Patton's eyes lit up, recognizing a kindred spirit. Exactly, Mitchell. Exactly like cavalry. Colonel Graves looked between the two men, his expression hardening. Tanks are meant to support the infantry. That's their purpose. With respect, sir, Jimmy said, choosing his words carefully, I believe the Germans are winning not because their tanks are necessarily better, but because they understand how to use them. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Jimmy had crossed an invisible line. Questioning American military doctrine, especially in front of a superior officer, was career suicide. But the reports from Poland kept flashing through his mind, entire divisions encircled, thousands of men captured, all because the Germans had reimagined what tanks could do. Finally, Colonel Graves spoke, his voice cold. Lieutenant Mitchell, report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. We'll discuss your perspectives in private. As Graves walked away, Major Patton stepped closer to Jimmy. You've got guts, Mitchell, and you're right, but be careful who hears you say it. That evening, Jimmy sat at his desk in the officers' quarters. A letter from his father opened before him. Joseph Mitchell had served in the Great War, had seen the first tanks lumber across the battlefield at Cambrai. His words seemed to leap off the page. A machine is only as good as the man who operates it, Jimmy. Remember that. The Germans may have better tanks, better planes, better guns, but America has better men. That's what will win this war if it comes to us. Jimmy folded the letter and slipped it into his breast pocket, where he would carry it for years to come. Tomorrow might bring a reprimand, even a transfer. But tonight he knew he had spoken the truth. And in war, truth was often the first casualty. Chapter 2. The Aberdeen Project. The reprimand never came. Instead, 1 week later, Jimmy found himself reassigned to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The official reason: his mechanical expertise was needed for tank evaluation. The unofficial reason, delivered by a sympathetic Major Patton: Graves wants you gone, but Washington wants your brain. Aberdeen was America's premier testing facility for military vehicles. As Jimmy drove through the gates on a crisp autumn morning, the sprawling complex hummed with activity. Engineers, mechanics, and soldiers swarmed around half-assembled vehicles. The air smelled of grease, gasoline, and purpose. A young corporal directed Jimmy to the main testing hangar, where he was met by a sight that stopped him in his tracks. There, dominating the center of the floor, sat the strangest tank he'd ever seen. Taller than the M2, with a main gun jutting awkwardly from the right side of the hull and a smaller turret on top. The M3 medium tank, Lieutenant Mitchell. The voice came from beside him, soft but authoritative. America's answer to the Panzer. Jimmy turned to find a woman in civilian clothes, clipboard in hand, studying him with intelligent eyes. In her mid-30s, she wore her dark hair pulled back in a practical style, her face free of makeup, her posture suggesting she was accustomed to being the only woman in rooms full of men. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Wright," she said, extending her hand. "Ballistics and armor penetration analysis." Jimmy shook her hand, noting the firm grip. "Lieutenant James Mitchell, tank operations and mechanical systems." "I know who you are, Lieutenant. Your report on German tank tactics caused quite a stir." Jimmy felt a flush of embarrassment. That wasn't an official report. "Perhaps it should have been." She gestured to the M3. "What do you think? First impression." Jimmy walked around the tank slowly, taking in every detail. The high profile, the sponson-mounted 75mm gun, the smaller 37mm gun in the turret. He climbed up and peered inside, noting the cramped conditions, the complex arrangement of guns. When he finally spoke, he chose honesty. "It looks like a committee designed it, one that couldn't agree." To his surprise, Dr. Wright laughed. "Precisely. Infantry wanted a tank killer. Artillery wanted a moving gun platform. Ordnance wanted commonality of parts. Everyone got something, no one got everything. And the result is a compromise that might fail at all its jobs. That's what we're here to determine." She consulted her clipboard. "You'll be working with my team on crew survivability assessments." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. Survivability. "Reports from North Africa suggest our current tanks become funeral pyres when hit. We need to understand why." The blunt assessment chilled Jimmy. He thought of the young men he'd trained at Fort Knox. Imagined them trapped in burning steel coffins. "I want to see the reports." Over the next weeks, Jimmy immersed himself in the grim reality of tank warfare. The British, using American-built tanks, were facing devastating losses against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The reports were clinical in their description, but couldn't hide the human cost. Tanks hit by German shells erupted into flames, their ammunition cooking off, crews burned alive, or gunned down as they attempted escape. In the evenings, Jimmy and Eleanor pored over the data, developing a friendship forged in shared purpose. She was brilliant, her mind razor-sharp, her understanding of ballistics unmatched. But more importantly, she cared about the men who would crew these machines. "The problem is fundamental," Eleanor explained one night, sketching on a pad and as they shared coffee in the nearly empty lab. "The Sherman uses a radial aircraft engine that runs on high-octane gasoline. When penetrated, fuel lines rupture, gasoline vaporizes, and our boys cook," Jimmy finished grimly. "Precisely. The Germans use diesel in their Panthers, less flammable." Jimmy rubbed his tired eyes. "Can we switch to diesel?" "Not without redesigning the entire powertrain, and production is already ramping up." "So we're knowingly sending men into battle in tanks that turn into crematoriums when hit." Eleanor's eyes met his, sharing his moral burden. "Unless we can find another solution." The solution came to Jimmy in the middle of the night. He rushed to the testing grounds at dawn, finding Eleanor already there, running calculations. "Wet stowage," he said without preamble. She looked up. "What?" "We store the ammunition in water jackets. If the tank is hit, the water absorbs some of the heat, reduces the chance of the ammunition cooking off." Eleanor's eyes widened. "That might work, but it would add weight, reduce ammunition capacity." better than burning alive. They presented the idea to the project lead, Colonel Matthews, a pragmatic officer in his 50s who valued results over protocol. He listened attentively, then shook his head. Production schedules won't allow for major redesigns now. The Army needs tanks yesterday. But sir, Jimmy protested, we're talking about saving lives. We're talking about winning a war, Lieutenant. Tanks that don't reach the battlefield save no one. Jimmy left the meeting seething with frustration. That night, a letter arrived from his friend Sam Hendricks, now a lieutenant serving with the British in North Africa. The tanks are death traps, Jimmy, Sam had written in a shaking hand. We call them Ronson lighters after the cigarette lighter ad. Lights first time, every time. When we see the Panthers coming, men pray for a clean miss rather than a hit that doesn't kill them outright. For God's sake, if you're working on these machines, fix them. Jimmy read the letter 3 times, then made a decision that would alter the course of his career. If the Army wouldn't listen to reports, perhaps they would listen to a demonstration. The next day, during a scheduled firing test, Jimmy deliberately adjusted the target positioning for the German 88mm anti-tank gun they were using for penetration tests. The shell struck the M3 prototype exactly where he knew the fuel lines ran. The resulting explosion rocked the testing ground, the fireball rising 100 feet into the air. No crew had been inside, but the message was clear. As safety teams rushed to extinguish the blaze, Jimmy stood immobile, watching the tank burn. Colonel Matthews found him there an hour later, as crews still worked to cool the smoking hulk. That was no accident, Matthews said. It wasn't a question. No, sir. You risked a court-martial to make a point. I risked my career to save lives, sir. Matthews studied him for a long moment. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. And Lieutenant, bring Dr. Wright and those design modifications with you. Chapter 3, Forging the Sherman. The meeting with Colonel Matthews changed everything. Instead of a court-martial, Jimmy received a new assignment. Help develop the M4 Sherman, America's next-generation medium tank. The M3 would still go into production as a stopgap measure, but the M4 would incorporate some of the survivability improvements Jimmy and Eleanor had advocated. Not all of them, Matthews clarified. Production speed remains paramount, but wet stowage is approved for later models, and we're looking at improved armor placement. It was a partial victory, but Jimmy would take it. Over the next months, he assembled an unlikely team. Mike Donovan, a 45-year-old former Detroit assembly line worker with calloused hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of engines. Eleanor Wright, whose calculations guided their armor designs. And young Private Rodriguez, a former race car driver whose intuitive understanding of mobility and maneuverability proved invaluable. They worked around the clock, fighting bureaucratic inertia and material shortages. The Sherman took shape before their eyes, a compromise between firepower, protection, and mobility, but with one crucial advantage over its predecessors. It can be mass-produced, Donovan explained to Jimmy as they inspected the prototype's engine. That's what you Army boys don't always get. The best tank is the one you can make 10,000 of. Jimmy nodded, appreciating the pragmatism, and the one that keeps his crew alive to fight another day. The Sherman wouldn't be the best tank on the battlefield. Its 75mm gun was adequate but not exceptional. Its armor was moderate, but it would be reliable, maintainable, and most importantly, available in numbers that would overwhelm the enemy. As spring turned to summer in 1941, the prototype neared completion. America wasn't yet at war, but everyone at Aberdeen knew it was only a matter of time. The pressure to deliver mounted with each passing day. Then came the news that changed everything. Sam Hendricks was dead, his tank destroyed in a skirmish near Tobruk. The letter from his widow arrived on a rainy Tuesday, the paper tear-stained. He believed in you, Jimmy, she had written. He told me if anyone could make these tanks better, it was you. Please don't let other wives get letters like this one. That night, Jimmy worked until dawn, making final adjustments to the engine compartment design. When Eleanor found him there, eyes red-rimmed, she didn't need to ask why. We'll make it better, she promised, placing a hand on his shoulder. Not perfect, but better. Jimmy covered her hand with his own. It has to be good enough. Good enough to win. The final test of the Sherman prototype was scheduled for July 1941. Military observers from Washington would be present, their approval necessary for production to begin. Everything had to go perfectly. The morning dawned clear and hot. The Sherman sat on the testing ground, its olive drab paint fresh, its silhouette distinctive with the rounded turret and medium-length 75mm gun. Jimmy stood beside Colonel Matthews as the observers arrived, generals and procurement officers who would decide the tank's fate. "She'll perform," Jimmy assured Matthews. "We've triple-checked everything." The demonstration began with mobility tests. The Sherman accelerated across the proving ground, its Continental R975 radial engine pushing the 30-ton vehicle to 30 miles per hour. It climbed a 40-degree slope, crossed a trench, and pivoted in place. The observers nodded approvingly. Next came the firing tests. The 75-millimeter gun accurately struck targets at varying ranges, demonstrating its ability to engage both enemy armor and infantry. The observers scribbled notes, their expressions non-committal. "Now for the protection test," announced the rangemaster. This was the moment Jimmy dreaded. A captured German 50-millimeter anti-tank gun, similar to those mounted on Panzer IIIs, was positioned to fire at the Sherman's front armor. The tank was unmanned, instrumented to record the effects of the hit. The gun fired. The shell struck the Sherman's front glacis plate and ricocheted off, leaving only a dent. A murmur of approval ran through the observers. "Again," ordered the senior general, "aim for the side armor." Jimmy tensed. The side armor was thinner, more vulnerable. The gun fired again, and this time the shell penetrated. But instead of the catastrophic fire that had consumed the M3 prototype, there was only a contained flash as the shell detonated inside. "The wet stowage worked," Eleanor whispered beside him. "It contained the ammunition ignition." The observers huddled in discussion. Then the senior general approached Colonel Matthews. "Impressive vehicle, Colonel. We have some concerns about the gun's ability to defeat heavier German armor, but overall it meets our needs. Begin production immediately." As the observers departed, Jimmy should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt a complicated mix of relief, pride, and nagging doubt. The Sherman was better than what came before, but was it good enough? Would it protect its crew? Would it win battles? His thoughts were interrupted by a commotion from the test tank. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. A technician shouted for fire extinguishers. Jimmy and Donovan ran toward the tank. "Fuel line ruptured," Donovan shouted, climbing onto the hull. "The vibration from the shell impact must have broken a connector." The smoke thickened, turning to flame. Jimmy followed Donovan into the engine compartment, heat searing his lungs. They worked frantically to reach the valve that would cut off fuel flow. Suddenly, a secondary explosion rocked the tank. Jimmy was thrown backward, momentarily blinded. When his vision cleared, he saw Donovan trapped under a collapsed maintenance panel, flames licking around him. Without hesitation, Jimmy plunged back into the inferno. He heaved the panel off Donovan and dragged him toward the exit. The heat was unbearable, his uniform beginning to smolder. With a final surge of strength, he pushed Donovan through the hatch and followed, both men tumbling to the ground as fire crews converged on the burning tank. Jimmy's hands and face were badly burned, his lungs damaged from the superheated air. As medics worked over him, he caught a glimpse of the Sherman, now fully engulfed in flames. The irony wasn't lost on him. After all their work to prevent brewing up, the tank had betrayed them anyway. In the infirmary, bandaged and sedated, Jimmy received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Matthews entered quietly, standing beside the bed with uncharacteristic hesitation. "How's Donovan?" Jimmy asked, his voice raspy. "He'll live, thanks to you." Jimmy closed his eyes. "And the Sherman?" "Production proceeds as planned. The incident has been classified as a maintenance accident unrelated to the design." "That's a lie." "That's war, Lieutenant. We need those tanks." Jimmy tried to sit up, wincing with pain. "Then I'm going with them." Matthews frowned. "You're an engineer, not a combat officer." "I helped build it. I'll fight in it." Jimmy's resolve hardened. "I won't send men into battle in a machine I wouldn't trust with my own life." The colonel studied him for a long moment. "I'll make the arrangements." "Captain." Jimmy blinked. "Sir, you're being promoted. If you're going to command tanks in combat, you'll need the appropriate rank." After Matthews left, Jimmy painfully reached for his father's letter, tucked as always in his breast pocket. The edges were singed from the fire, but the words remained legible. "War isn't about having the best weapons. It's about having the best men." He carefully folded the letter and began composing one of his own. "Dear Father," he wrote, his bandaged hands shaking, "I will not only design these tanks, I will lead them into battle. Because you were right. It's not about the machine. It's about the men inside." 3 months later, Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. 6 months after that, Captain James Mitchell, his burns healed, but the scars still livid against his skin, boarded a transport ship bound for North Africa. With him went the 1st Battalion of Sherman tanks, and the weight of knowing both their strengths and their fatal flaws. The crucible of combat awaited. Chapter 4, Into the Fire. November 8, 1942. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, began in darkness. Captain Jimmy Mitchell stood on the deck of the LST, landing ship, tank, watching the shoreline of Algeria emerge from the pre-dawn gloom. Beside him, Sergeant Patrick Irish O'Malley, a 38-year-old former Boston coal miner, with forearms like steel cables and a brogue that thickened when he was nervous. "Think Jerry knows we're coming, Captain?" O'Malley asked, lighting a cigarette and cupping the flame against the sea breeze. "They know," Jimmy replied. "Question is whether they can stop us." Below decks, 5 Sherman tanks waited, fueled and armed. Each represented months of design work, countless hours of testing, and now the lives of its 5-man crew. Jimmy had handpicked his tankers, building a team that reflected America itself. Besides O'Malley, there was Corporal Thomas Doc Jefferson, a former high school teacher from Harlem, whose wire-rimmed glasses gave him a scholarly appearance, belied by his expertise with the Sherman's 75mm gun. Private William "Cowboy" Williams had worked his family's Texas ranch before the war, bringing a natural feel for the terrain to his role as driver. Private Stanley Brooklyn Kowalski, the son of Polish immigrants, served as the bow gunner, his compact frame ideal for the cramped position. And Private John Chief Running Bear, a Lakota from South Dakota, completed the crew as the loader, his powerful arms capable of maintaining a rapid rate of fire in the heat of battle. The men called themselves Mitchell's Marauders, painting the name on the side of Jimmy's command tank. The brass had looked the other way. In war, such small liberties were overlooked if the unit performed. The LST's bow doors opened with a mechanical groan as the vessel ground onto the beach. Engines roared to life below. Jimmy descended to the tank deck where his crew awaited. "Gentlemen," he said, climbing onto his Sherman, "remember your training, remember what we're fighting for, and remember, no matter what happens, we bring everyone home." The tanks rolled down the ramp onto North African soil, their treads churning the sand. The first day passed in a blur of movement, securing beachheads, establishing perimeters. The real test would come when they encountered Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps. They didn't have to wait long. Dawn of the second day. Jimmy's company had advanced inland about 15 miles when scouts reported German armor approaching. 3 Panzer IIIs, supported by mechanized infantry. Jimmy's 5 Shermans took defensive positions behind a low ridge, engines idling, crews tense. "Range, Doc?" Jimmy asked, his eyes on the approaching German tanks through his binoculars. 1,200 yards, Captain," Jefferson replied from the gunner's position. "Outside our effective range." Jimmy knew the Panzer's 50mm gun had the advantage at distance. Their only hope was to close the gap, use their mobility. "All tanks," he spoke into the radio, "prepare to advance on my command. We'll hit them from multiple angles, confuse their fire." He felt the weight of his father's letter in his pocket. The best men, not the best weapons. Time to prove it. "Advance!" The 5 Shermans crested the ridge simultaneously, accelerating down the slope toward the surprised Germans. The Panzers, expecting a defensive battle, momentarily hesitated. It was enough. Jimmy's tank fired first, the 75mm shell striking just short of the lead Panzer, kicking up a cloud of sand that obscured the German gunner's view. The Sherman lurched as Williams maneuvered it in an evasive pattern. "Reload," Jimmy ordered, and Chief slammed another round into the breach. The German tanks recovered quickly, their 50mm guns tracking the American movement. A shell whizzed past Jimmy's turret, close enough that he felt the disturbance in the air. "Closing to 800 yards, Jefferson reported. "I have a shot." "Take it." The Sherman's gun boomed, the shell striking the lead Panzer's track, immobilizing it. The German turret swiveled, returning fire. To Jimmy's left, one of his tanks took a hit, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. "Parker's been hit," O'Malley shouted. Jimmy watched anxiously, remembering the burning prototype at Aberdeen. But instead of the catastrophic fire he feared, the Sherman's crew evacuated in good order. The tank damaged but not destroyed. "Continue the advance," Jimmy ordered. "Concentrate fire on the immobilized Panzer." The remaining 4 Shermans pressed forward, firing in sequence, keeping the Germans reacting rather than initiating. A second Panzer took a hit to its thinner side armor, smoke billowing from the hatches. The crew bailed out, running for the cover of their infantry support. The 3rd Panzer, recognizing the shifting odds, began a fighting withdrawal. Jimmy ordered his tanks to hold position rather than pursue. They had won the first encounter, but at a cost. One Sherman damaged, two men lightly wounded. As the adrenaline of battle faded, Jimmy examined the disabled German tank. The Panzer III was smaller than the Sherman, its armor thinner, its gun less powerful. Yet it had nearly prevailed through superior tactics and crew training. "We were lucky," Jimmy admitted to O'Malley as they supervised the recovery of Parker's damaged Sherman. "They hesitated. Next time they won't." O'Malley nodded, his usually jovial face solemn. "Then we'd better not hesitate either, sir." That night, around a small fire carefully shielded from enemy observation, Jimmy wrote in his journal, the day's engagement had confirmed what he'd always suspected. The Sherman could win, but not through technical superiority. Its advantages lay elsewhere. "Our strength is in our numbers, our logistics, and our men," he wrote. "The Sherman isn't the best tank, but it might be the right tank for this war. If we can replace our losses while the Germans cannot, if we can repair rather than abandon, if we can adapt our tactics to emphasize mobility over direct confrontation." He paused, remembering the prototype burning at Aberdeen. How many more would burn here in actual combat? How many crews would die before the improved designs reached the front? Jimmy closed the journal and looked up at the stars, scattered like shell casings across the North African sky. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more tests for the Sherman and its crews. The real war was just beginning. And so was the real test of the tank he had helped create. Chapter 5. The Crucible of Combat. The weeks that followed tested Jimmy's faith in both the Sherman and his own abilities as a commander. As the Allied forces pushed deeper into Tunisia, the opposition stiffened. Rommel's Africa Corps fought with the desperation of men who knew they were being squeezed between the advancing Americans and the British Eighth Army coming from Egypt. Jimmy's company saw action at Sidi Bouzid, Kasserine Pass, and a dozen smaller engagements. The patterns became clear. In open terrain where they could maneuver, the Shermans performed adequately. Their mechanical reliability proved a significant advantage. While German tanks frequently broke down, the Shermans kept running. The ability to repair damaged vehicles quickly meant that Jimmy rarely operated at less than full strength for long. But when forced into direct confrontation with German armor, especially the heavier models, the Sherman's deficiencies became painfully apparent. The 75mm guns struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of the newer Panzer IVs, while German 50mm and especially 88mm guns could destroy a Sherman at ranges beyond the American tank's effective reach. Jimmy adapted. He emphasized movement, coordination, and combined arms. His tankers learned to work closely with artillery and air support, to attack from the flanks, to hit and withdraw before the Germans could bring their superior firepower to bear. "We're not trying to outpunch them," he explained to his crews. "We're trying to outmaneuver them. Like a boxer against a stronger opponent, we jab, we move, we never stand still long enough to take the big hit." The men responded to his leadership, their confidence growing with each successful engagement. Even when they lost tanks, the crews usually survived thanks to the Sherman's generally good hatch design. Jimmy insisted on constant evacuation drills, ensuring his men could exit a damaged tank in seconds. But the true test came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. The American forces had advanced into the mountain passes of western Tunisia, overextended and overconfident. Rommel saw the opportunity and launched a counterattack with his best remaining units, including a company of the dreaded Tiger Warrant tanks. Jimmy's company was holding a critical road junction when the radio crackled with urgent warnings. German armor, at least 15 tanks including several Tigers, was headed their way. No reinforcements were available. Other American units were already in retreat. "We can't hold against Tigers," Jefferson stated flatly as they gathered around the map spread on the hood of a Jeep. "Not in a direct fight." Jimmy studied the terrain. Mountains to the north, open desert to the south, the road cutting through a narrow pass to the east. "We're not going to fight them directly," he decided. "We're going to channel them, hit their flanks, delay them long enough for our forces to regroup." He divided his company, positioning 3 Shermans to cover the road from concealed positions, while taking his own tank and another to set up an ambush on a ridge overlooking the likely German approach. The wait was excruciating. Hours passed with no sign of the enemy. The sun climbed high, baking the tanks like ovens. Inside Jimmy Sherman, the temperature exceeded 120 degrees. Men stripped to their undershirts, drinking water sparingly from canteens that quickly grew warm. Then at mid-afternoon, the distant sound of engines. German tanks, advancing cautiously up the road. "Hold fire," Jimmy ordered over the radio. "Let them commit to the pass." Through his binoculars, he counted the enemy force. 10 Panzer IVs, 5 Tigers. The Tigers led the formation, their massive 88mm guns scanning for threats, their thick armor gleaming dully in the desert sun. Jimmy had never seen a Tiger in person before. The reports hadn't done justice to its size and menace. The Sherman's 75mm gun would struggle to penetrate its armor even at close range. "Chief," he said quietly to his loader, "prepare the special rounds." The special rounds were a closely guarded secret, a limited supply of HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, ammunition, with tungsten cores instead of steel. In theory, they could penetrate a Tiger's side armor at moderate ranges. In practice, they were untested in combat. The German column entered the pass, advancing between the steep rock walls. Jimmy waited until the last Tiger had entered before giving the order. "All tanks open fire. Concentrate on the rear vehicles. Block their retreat." The hidden Shermans opened fire simultaneously, their shells striking the last Panzer IV in the column, immobilizing it and blocking the narrow road. Before the Germans could react, Jimmy's 2 tanks on the ridge fired down on the trapped column. The battle devolved into chaos. The German tanks, unable to advance or retreat, began returning fire at the hidden American positions. The superior German guns quickly found their mark. One of the Shermans covering the road took a direct hit from a Tiger's 88mm gun, the shell tearing through its frontal armor like paper. The tank erupted in flames. "Whitley's been hit," O'Malley shouted. Jimmy watched in horror as only 2 crew members escaped the burning Sherman. The other 3 were trapped inside as ammunition began to cook off, the tank turning into the funeral pyre he had always feared. "Keep firing," he ordered, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Doc, target the lead Tiger's tracks." Jefferson aimed carefully, the 75mm gun roaring. The HVAP round struck the Tiger's drive sprocket, shattering it. The massive tank lurched to a halt, blocking the column's advance. The German commander reacted quickly, ordering his tanks to fan out where the terrain permitted, seeking to climb the slopes toward Jimmy's position. Jimmy ordered his second ridge tank to withdraw to a prepared fallback position, while his own tank continued to fire, covering the retreat. "Williams, get us down from here," Jimmy ordered his driver. "Back to position, Charlie." The Sherman reversed, dropping behind the ridgeline just as German shells began impacting around them. They relocated quickly, rejoining the remaining tanks of the company. For the next 3 hours, Jimmy conducted a fighting withdrawal, using the terrain to maximum advantage, never allowing the superior German force to bring its full firepower to bear. By nightfall, they had delayed the German advance long enough for American artillery to move into position, their heavy guns now targeting the pass. As darkness fell, Jimmy conducted a grim roll call. 3 Shermans destroyed, 8 men dead, 5 wounded. His company was reduced to 2 operational tanks. Yet they had delayed a superior force long enough to prevent a breakthrough that could have jeopardized the entire American position in Tunisia. That night, as medics tended the wounded, Jimmy sat alone, writing condolence letters to the families of his fallen men. O'Malley found him there, offering a canteen of water. "Not your fault, Captain," the sergeant said quietly. "We were outgunned." "We were outgunned because I helped design an inadequate tank," Jimmy replied bitterly. "I knew its weaknesses. I knew what we'd face." "You designed what could be built," O'Malley countered. "And then you came here to make sure it was used right. Those boys didn't die because of the Sherman. They died because that's war." Jimmy nodded, accepting the harsh truth. "I need to make it better, Irish. Whatever it takes." The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days later, a jeep arrived at their position. The driver, a lieutenant from division headquarters, carried orders. Captain Mitchell was being temporarily recalled to the United States. His experience with both the design and combat use of the Sherman was needed for the next evolution of American armor. "You leave tomorrow," the lieutenant explained. "They're flying you back. Priority transport." Jimmy protested, unwilling to leave his men. But the orders were explicit. General Patton himself had requested him by name. That evening, he gathered his remaining crews. "I've been ordered back to help improve our tanks," he explained. "I'm going to make sure they fix what needs fixing." "Thicker armor?" asked Kowalski. "Better gun?" Jefferson suggested. "Both if I can get them," Jimmy promised. "But more importantly, better protection for the crews. No more Ronsons." The men nodded solemnly, all too familiar with the Sherman's tendency to catch fire when hit. The British nickname for the tank, after the Ronson cigarette lighter's slogan, "Lights first time, every time," was grimly accurate. Before dawn the next morning, Jimmy packed his few personal belongings. The last item was his father's letter, now worn and faded, but still his talisman. As he carefully placed it in his breast pocket, O'Malley approached. "The boys wanted you to have this, Captain." The sergeant handed him a small metal object, a Sherman tank's gun sight, modified into a keychain. Engraved on it were the words "Mitchell's Marauders" and the names of the men who had died at Kasserine. "To remind you what you're fighting for," O'Malley said simply. Jimmy's throat tightened. "Take care of them, Irish. I'll be back." "With better tanks," O'Malley nodded. "We'll be waiting." As the transport plane lifted off from the dusty airfield, Jimmy looked down at the North African landscape where he had experienced both triumph and tragedy. The Sherman had proven itself a capable tank in many respects, reliable, mobile, and producible in vast numbers. But its flaws had been written in the blood of good men. He clutched the makeshift keychain, feeling the engraved names under his fingers. Whatever political battles awaited in Washington, whatever resistance he might face from procurement officers and production managers, he would fight with the same determination he had shown at Kasserine Pass. The Sherman would evolve, would improve, and when it did, Jimmy Mitchell would return to lead his men once more into battle with a tank worthy of their courage. The real war, he knew, had just begun. The C-47 transport plane descended through cloud cover, revealing the industrial sprawl of Detroit below. Captain Jimmy Mitchell pressed his scarred face against the cold window, watching the factories grow larger. Smokestacks belched black plumes into the gray Michigan sky, a sight that would have horrified environmentalists in peacetime, but now represented America's war machine at full throttle. 3 weeks had passed since he'd left North Africa. 3 weeks of debriefings at the Pentagon, of explaining the Sherman's strengths and weaknesses to men who had never heard a German 88mm shell scream overhead. 3 weeks of nightmares about burning tanks and the men trapped inside them. The plane touched down at Willow Run Airport, the massive new airfield built alongside Ford's B-24 bomber plant. As Jimmy descended the steps to the tarmac, a staff car waited, a young lieutenant standing at attention beside it. "Captain Mitchell?" "Lieutenant Ross, sir. I'm to escort you to the tank arsenal." Jimmy nodded, throwing his duffel into the back seat. "How long have you been stateside, Lieutenant?" "Never left, sir." The young man looked down. 4F, heart murmur. Jimmy studied him. Ross couldn't have been more than 22, rail-thin with eager eyes that couldn't quite hide his shame at not being overseas. "Lucky for me," Jimmy said, climbing into the passenger seat. "I need someone who knows his way around the bureaucracy here." The Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan was the largest tank factory in the world. As they approached, Jimmy could see it sprawled across the landscape, a monument to American industrial might. Outside, hundreds of brand-new Sherman tanks were lined up in neat rows, waiting for transport to the coasts and then overseas. "They're making 40 a day now," Ross informed him as they passed through the security checkpoint. "Soon it'll be 50. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Thousands of workers, many of them women, operated massive machines. Welding sparks showered down from overhead gantries. Engines roared on test stands. The smell of hot metal, oil, and sweat permeated everything. "Captain Mitchell!" Jimmy turned to see a familiar face approaching. Mike Donovan, his burn scars nearly matching Jimmy's own, pushed through the crowd. The two men embraced briefly. "They told me you were coming," Donovan said, his voice raised above the factory noise. "About damn time. How long have you been back?" "Month longer than you. They pulled me after Aberdeen for technical consultation." Donovan made air quotes around the words. Really, they just wanted someone who'd actually worked on the Sherman's guts. "And?" Donovan's expression darkened. "Come with me." He led Jimmy through the factory floor to a quieter office area, closing the door behind them. On the walls hung technical drawings of the Sherman, along with photographs from the front. "It's worse than we thought," Donovan said without preamble. "The casualty reports from North Africa are grim. Sherman crews are suffering 30% casualties, mostly burns." Jimmy closed his eyes briefly. "I know, I've seen it. But here's the rub." Donovan spread blueprints across the desk. "We've developed solutions. Better ammunition stowage, improved fire suppression, hell, even a modified Christie's suspension that would make the tank more stable when hit. But," he trailed off. "But what?" "Production schedules." Donovan's voice was bitter. They won't slow the line to implement most of the changes. Can't interrupt the flow of tanks to the front. Jimmy understood the cruel math. Imperfect tanks now versus better tanks later, with a gap that could cost battles or even campaigns. What can we change? Jimmy asked, studying the blueprints. Wet stowage is approved for new production models starting next month. Some armor improvements around the ammunition. But the fundamental issues, the high profile, the gasoline engine, the inadequate gun, those stay. Jimmy thought of the tigers he'd faced at Kasserine Pass, how their 88mm shells had cut through Sherman armor like paper. He thought of the men who had burned to death inside their tanks. Not good enough, he said quietly. Who do I need to talk to? Donovan gave a humorless laugh. How about the Secretary of War, if that's what it takes? That night in his hotel room, Jimmy drafted a report unlike any he'd written before. Not a technical document, but a narrative, describing in visceral detail what happened when a Sherman met a Panzer IV or, God forbid, a Tiger. He included excerpts from his combat journal, accounts from other tank commanders, and the grim casualty statistics. He titled it simply, The Cost in Blood. The next morning, he handed the report to Lieutenant Ross. This needs to go directly to Major General Devers at the Armored Force Command. Ross looked uncertain. Sir, there are channels for... Lieutenant, Jimmy cut him off. Men are dying because we're not fixing what we know is broken. Either help me or get out of my way. 3 days later, Jimmy received a response. Not a written reply, but a summons to an emergency conference at the Detroit Tank Arsenal. When he arrived, he found the conference room filled with senior officers, production managers, and engineers. At the head of the table sat Major General Jacob Devers himself, commander of the armored force. Captain Mitchell, Devers nodded as Jimmy entered. Your report has caused quite a stir. That was my intention, sir. Some might call it insubordinate. I call it necessary. Devers studied him for a long moment, then surprised Jimmy by smiling slightly. Sit down, Captain. We're here to listen. For the next 3 hours, Jimmy laid out everything he had learned in combat. The Sherman's vulnerabilities, the German advantages, the tactical adaptations that had allowed his company to survive. He didn't mince words or soften the reality. Gentlemen, he concluded, the Sherman is not a bad tank. In many ways, it's a good one. But we're sending men to fight Panthers and Tigers with inadequate armor and armament. It's like sending a boxer into the ring with one hand tied behind his back. Silence fell over the room. Finally, an older civilian stood. From Donovan's whisper, Jimmy learned this was William Knudsen, the production czar who had transformed American industry for war. Captain, Knudsen said, his accent betraying his Danish origins. What you say makes sense, but you must understand we are fighting a war of production. Every day, this factory doesn't produce 40 tanks is a day we fall behind. Changes cost time. And no changes cost lives, Jimmy countered. Lives are being lost across all fronts, Captain. The question is how to minimize that cost overall. The debate continued, growing heated at times. Some officers dismissed Jimmy's concerns as the perspective of a single tank commander. Others acknowledged the problems but argued they were unavoidable. The production managers insisted major redesigns were impossible without disrupting the war effort. Finally, General Devers raised his hand for silence. Captain Mitchell isn't just one voice, he said firmly. His observations match reports from across the North African theater. The Sherman has issues that need addressing. He turned to Knudsen. Bill, what can we do immediately without stopping production? Knudsen considered. Wet stowage is already approved. We can accelerate that. Add applique armor to the ammunition bays. And perhaps, he paused, calculating, perhaps we can tool up a limited production line for the 76mm gun upgrade. Jimmy felt a surge of hope. The 76mm gun would give the Sherman a fighting chance against German armor. And what about the diesel engine proposal, Jimmy pressed? The British are already converting some of their Shermans. This triggered another round of debate, but eventually a compromise emerged. Major changes would be implemented gradually to avoid production disruptions. The most critical survivability improvements would come first. The 76mm gun would be rushed into limited production, and Jimmy would stay in Detroit for another month, working directly with the engineers to prioritize modifications. As the meeting broke up, General Devers approached Jimmy privately. That took courage, Mitchell. Not many captains would risk their careers challenging the entire production system. It wasn't courage, sir. It was obligation to my men. Devers nodded. You've made enemies today, but also allies. He handed Jimmy a folder. Orders for when you finish here. You're being promoted to major and given command of a tank battalion, the 751st. They'll be receiving the first of the upgraded Shermans. Jimmy accepted the folder, emotions conflicting within him. Pride at the promotion and command, determination to implement the improvements. And beneath it all, a nagging fear that it wouldn't be enough, that more men would die in burning Shermans before the war was done. That evening, he found himself in a quiet corner of the hotel bar, nursing a whiskey. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Is this seat taken?" Jimmy looked up to see Eleanor Wright, still in her civilian clothes but with the tired eyes of someone working 18-hour days. His spirits lifted at the sight of her. "It is now," he replied, gesturing for her to sit. "When did you get to Detroit?" "Yesterday. They've seconded me to the arsenal for ballistics testing on the 76mm upgrade." She studied his face. "I heard about the meeting. Quite the sensation you caused. Had to be done." Eleanor nodded, ordering her own drink. "How bad was it, in Africa?" Jimmy was silent for a long moment. Most people ask this question out of morbid curiosity or polite conversation. Eleanor asked because she needed to know, needed to understand the real consequences of design decisions made on drawing boards in comfortable offices. "We lost good men," he finally said. "Some tanks brewed up so fast the crews had no chance. Others, we managed to get out. The Sherman can fight, can win even, but only if we use it right. Hit and run, flank attacks. Never stand and slug it out with Panthers or Tigers. And the crews know this? They learn fast or they die." Eleanor's hand found his on the table, her fingers cool against his skin. "We're going to make it better, Jimmy. The 76mm gun is just the start." For the first time in months, Jimmy felt something like hope. Not that the Sherman would become the equal of the Tiger, that was impossible without a complete redesign, but that it might give its crews a fighting chance. "Tell me about the gun," he said. As Eleanor described the technical specifications of the 76mm upgrade, Jimmy felt his focus returning. This was why he had come back to America, not just to advocate for improvements, but to help implement them, to make sure that when he returned to the front, he would bring not just promises, but tangible changes that would save American lives. The next month passed in a blur of 12-hour days at the arsenal. Jimmy worked alongside engineers, production managers, and test crews. He drove prototype Shermans with modified suspensions. He supervised firing tests of the new 76mm gun. He studied armor penetration reports until his eyes burned. And slowly the improved Sherman took shape. Not a completely new tank. There wasn't time for that, but a better version of the existing design. When the first production models with wet stowage and applique armor rolled off the line, Jimmy allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. On his last day at the arsenal, Donovan presented him with a gift, a combat jacket with the 751st Tank Battalion insignia already sewn on the shoulder. "For when you rejoin the fight," Donovan said. "Give 'em hell, Major." Jimmy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He'd done what he could here. Now it was time to return to the war, to put these improvements to the test in the crucible of combat. He only hoped they would be enough. Chapter 7, The Industrial Giant. Before departing for the European theater, Jimmy received an unexpected invitation. A personal tour of Ford's massive Willow Run bomber plant with Henry Ford II himself. At 25, the young Ford had recently taken over the company from his grandfather and was eager to demonstrate America's industrial might to someone who would see its products in combat. The scale of Willow Run defied comprehension. A mile-long assembly line where B-24 Liberator bombers were built at an ever-increasing pace. When Jimmy visited, they were completing one bomber every 60 minutes. Ford promised that soon it would be one every 55 minutes. "This is how America wins wars, Major," Ford said as they watched a completed B-24 roll out of the factory into the morning sun. "Not by building the perfect weapon, but by building more weapons than the enemy can destroy." Jimmy thought of the German tanks he'd faced, individually superior, meticulously crafted, but few in number and difficult to repair. "The Germans build tanks like they're works of art," Jimmy observed. "We build them like they're Model Ts," Ford laughed. "Exactly, and who won the automobile wars? Not the custom coach builders. Mass production, standardization, interchangeable parts. That's how you equip an army." They continued the tour, watching as thousands of workers, many of them women, assembled the massive aircraft. Jimmy noted the efficiency of the operation, how problems were solved on the fly, how quality control was maintained despite the blistering pace. You know, Ford said as they paused for coffee, my grandfather believed in something he called planned obsolescence. The idea that products should be designed to be replaced rather than repaired indefinitely. Jimmy frowned. That works for civilian automobiles, but in war it's even more important, Ford interrupted. The Sherman isn't designed to last 20 years. It's designed to last long enough to win this war. And if that means we accept certain compromises to produce more of them faster, that's a rational choice. The conversation stayed with Jimmy as he flew east to meet his new command. He understood the logic of America's production strategy. But logic was cold comfort when you were facing a Panther tank with your inferior 75mm gun, or when you were pulling burned men from a Sherman hit by an 88. Yet Ford was right about one thing. America's true advantage lay in its industrial capacity. No matter how many Shermans the Germans destroyed, more would keep coming. The question was whether the men inside those tanks would survive long enough to see victory. Chapter 8. New Command, New Challenges. May 1943. England was a patchwork of military encampments as the Allies prepared for the eventual invasion of Europe. The 751st Tank Battalion was stationed in Dorset, training on the rolling countryside that somewhat resembled the terrain they would face in France. Major Jimmy Mitchell arrived on a rainy afternoon, the kind of persistent drizzle that turned everything to mud and seeped cold into a man's bones. His new executive officer, Captain Frank Miller, met him at the train station, a stocky Pennsylvanian with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and eyes that had seen combat in North Africa. Welcome to England, Major, Miller said, throwing Jimmy's duffel into a jeep. Hope you brought your galoshes. The battalion headquarters was a requisitioned manor house, its elegant rooms now filled with maps, radios, and the organized chaos of a military command post. Miller gave Jimmy a quick briefing as they drove. 3 companies, A through C, 17 Sherman tanks each. Support company with lighted tanks and half-tracks. Most of the men are green, but the officers and NCOs are mostly veterans from North Africa or Sicily. We're getting the new Shermans with wet stowage, 1st Battalion to be fully equipped with them. Jimmy nodded. And the 76mm upgrade? Miller grimaced. That's the problem, sir. We were supposed to get them, but there's been a delay. Word is they're prioritizing artillery production. We've got the standard 75mm for now. Another compromise. Another delay that would cost lives. Jimmy pushed down his frustration. What about training? Doing what we can with the space available. British are tight with their fuel allotments, so we can't run the tanks as much as I'd like. Gunnery practice is limited too. Ammunition shortages. Always constraints, always compromises. Jimmy wondered how the Germans were managing with their factories under constant bombing. The jeep pulled up to the manor house and Jimmy got his first look at his new command. The tanks were parked in the estate's gardens, camouflage netting strung over them against aerial observation. Crews worked on their vehicles, the familiar sounds of wrenches on metal and men's voices carrying through the rain. Assemble the company commanders, Jimmy ordered. I want to meet them right away. An hour later, Jimmy sat across from his 3 company commanders in what had once been the Manor's library. Captain John Winters of Able Company was a career Army man, steady and methodical. Captain David Reynolds of Baker Company had been a history teacher before the war, bringing an intellectual approach to tank warfare. And Captain Thomas Green of Charlie Company was the youngest, a former enlisted man who'd earned a battlefield commission in Tunisia. Gentlemen, Jimmy began, I've just come from Detroit, where I've been working on improvements to the Sherman. Some of those improvements are in the tanks you're now receiving. Others are still in the pipeline. But I want to be clear about one thing. The Sherman is still outclassed by the latest German armor. He let that sink in before continuing. That doesn't mean we can't win. It doesn't mean we won't win. But it means we need to be smarter, more coordinated, and better trained than the enemy. We don't have the luxury of trading shot for shot with Panthers and Tigers. Captain Reynolds spoke up. We've been developing new tactics based on reports from Italy, sir, focusing on flank attacks, coordination with air support, and artillery. Good, we'll expand on that. Jimmy moved to the map on the wall showing the coast of France. In the coming invasion, we'll be facing the best remaining German armor. They know their only chance is to push us back into the sea. Our job will be to prevent that, to establish a beachhead, and then break out into open country. With inferior tanks, Captain Green said bluntly. Jimmy met his gaze. With more tanks, better logistics, and superior air support, and with crews who understand both the strengths and limitations of their equipment. He spent the next hour outlining his expectations, his training priorities, and the lessons he'd learned in North Africa. The company commanders listened intently, asking questions that revealed their own combat experiences and concerns. When they were dismissed, Captain Miller remained behind. "Straight talk about the Sherman's limitations," Miller observed. "Not all commanders would be that candid." "They need to know what they're facing," Jimmy replied. "Better to confront it in training than learn it under fire." Over the next weeks, Jimmy threw himself into preparing his battalion for combat. He instituted rigorous training regimens, focusing particularly on rapid target acquisition, fire and movement techniques, and coordination with other arms. He personally inspected every tank, checking that the wet stowage was properly installed and that the crews understood the improved ammunition handling procedures. Most importantly, he got to know his men. Unlike in North Africa, where he'd commanded a single company, a battalion gave him less direct contact with the tankers. But Jimmy made it a point to spend time with each company, joining them for meals, participating in their training exercises, listening to their concerns. One evening, he found himself sitting around a campfire with a platoon from Baker Company, listening as they exchanged stories about home. Private Wilson was describing his family's farm in Iowa when the conversation shifted to their German opponents. "Is it true what they say about the Tigers, sir?" Wilson asked. "That our shells just bounce off them?" Jimmy considered his answer carefully. These men deserved the truth, but not in a way that would destroy their confidence. "Frontal shots with the 75mm against a Tiger's armor are generally ineffective beyond close range," he admitted. "But Tigers have weaknesses. Their sides and rear are more vulnerable. Their turret traverses slowly. They break down frequently, and there aren't many of them." "So how do we fight them?" another soldier asked. "As a team, with movement, with coordination, with air and artillery support. We don't try to slug it out one-on-one, Shisum. We use our numbers and our mobility." The men nodded, absorbing this. Jimmy could see some anxiety in their expressions, but also determination. They weren't fools. They knew they wouldn't be facing inferior opponents, but they trusted their training, their equipment, however imperfect, and most importantly, each other. "One more thing," Jimmy added. "The Sherman has one huge advantage many of you don't yet appreciate. It's reliable. German tanks break down constantly. They're complex, over-engineered, and hard to repair. Our tanks keep running. Never underestimate the importance of that in sustained combat." As spring turned to early summer, the atmosphere in England changed. Everyone knew the invasion was coming soon. Security tightened, training intensified. Equipment was waterproofed for the Channel crossing. Jimmy received his battalion's operational orders in a sealed envelope. They would be landing on Utah Beach as part of the second wave, supporting the 4th Infantry Division's push inland. Their first objective would be to help secure the causeway exits from the beach, then support the advance toward Carentan. The night before the originally scheduled invasion date, Jimmy couldn't sleep. He walked among his battalion's tanks, now loaded onto LSTs in Portland Harbor. The vessels were packed tight, tanks and vehicles sardined together, men sleeping wherever they could find space on the crowded decks. Captain Miller found him there, staring out at the dark water. "Weather report's bad," Miller said without preamble. "Word is they might postpone." Jimmy nodded. The channel was notoriously rough, and the landing craft would be vulnerable in high seas. Another day of waiting. "The men are ready, sir, as ready as they'll ever be." Jimmy thought about the improvements to the Sherman, the intensive training, the coordination with other arms that they'd practiced until it was second nature. They were indeed ready. But were the tanks? The postponement came as predicted. Another day of waiting, of tension, of last-minute checks and rechecks. And then, finally, the order to proceed. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The 751st Tank Battalion was part of the second wave, scheduled to land at HPC in 90 minutes. As their LST approached Utah Beach, Jimmy stood in the turret of his command tank, watching through binoculars as the first wave fought to establish a beachhead. Smoke shrouded much of the shoreline. Occasional flashes of gunfire punctuated the gray morning. Navy guns thundered from offshore, pounding German positions. The noise was continuous, a physical presence that vibrated through the hull of the ship. "Looks lighter than expected," Captain Miller observed from the tank beside Jimmy's. The resistance on Utah was indeed less fierce than at other beaches, a stroke of luck combined with effective pre-landing bombardment. We'll find the Germans inland, Jimmy replied. That's where the real test begins. The LST ground to a halt on the beach, its bow doors swinging open to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Vehicles and men moved inland, engineers cleared obstacles, medical teams treated wounded from the first wave. Jimmy gave the order, and the 751st began to disembark, his command tank leading the way. The sand was churned by hundreds of vehicles that had preceded them. Jimmy's driver navigated carefully, avoiding deeper ruts where tanks might bog down. Water dripped from the waterproofing materials as they moved up the beach, making the Sherman look like some primordial creature emerging from the sea. All companies maintain formation, Jimmy ordered over the radio. Proceed to Assembly Point Baker. Watch for mines. The battalion moved inland, passing abandoned German bunkers that had been neutralized by naval gunfire or the first wave of infantry. Dead bodies, both American and German, lay half buried in the sand. Medics worked frantically among the wounded. By mid-morning, the 751st had reached its assembly area just inland from the beach. Jimmy consulted his maps, confirming their position. They were off their planned landing point by nearly 2 miles, a navigation error that had actually worked in their favor, bringing them ashore in a less defended sector. Orders from division, sir, his radio operator announced, were to proceed to Exit 2 and support the 8th Infantry Regiment's advance. Jimmy acknowledged the order and gathered his company commanders for a quick briefing. The plan was straightforward: push inland along the causeway, secure the high ground beyond, and prepare for a German counterattack that was sure to come. The reality proved more complex. As they moved away from the beach, the terrain became a patchwork of flooded fields and hedgerows, the infamous Norman bocage that would prove so challenging to tank operations. The Germans had flooded many low-lying areas, channeling the American advance along predictable routes where they could concentrate their defenses. This is tank-killing country, Captain Winters observed grimly as they surveyed the limited avenues of approach. The hedgerows, earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, divided the landscape into small fields, each a potential ambush site. Tanks would be forced to breach these barriers at specific points, making them vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. We adapt, Jimmy replied. Work with the engineers to create more crossing points. Use artillery to suppress likely German positions before we advance. And keep moving. Don't give them time to zero in their guns. The first encounters with German forces came late that afternoon. A platoon from Able Company, advancing along a narrow country road, was ambushed by a Panzerfaust team hidden in a hedgerow. The lead Sherman erupted in flames, blocking the road. Jimmy rushed forward with his command tank to assess the situation. The burning Sherman's crew had escaped, though 2 men were wounded. German infantry could be seen withdrawing through the bocage. No sign of enemy armor yet, Captain Winters reported. Just infantry and anti-tank teams. Jimmy nodded, studying the terrain. They're delaying, trying to slow our advance while they bring up reinforcements. We need to push through before their armor arrives. Throughout the remainder of D-Day and into the next morning, the 751st fought a series of small, sharp engagements against German infantry and anti-tank units. The Sherman's 75mm guns were effective against these lighter forces, and the battalion made steady progress inland, linking up with elements of the 4th Infantry Division. But Jimmy knew this was merely the prelude. The real test would come when the German armored divisions arrived to counter the invasion, and that test wasn't long in coming. Chapter 9, Clash of Armor, June 8, 1944. 2 days after D-Day. Intelligence reported elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division moving toward the American sector. Among their forces, a company of Panther tanks. Jimmy received the news during a hasty conference at division headquarters, a damaged farmhouse now filled with radio equipment and harried staff officers. They're trying to drive a wedge between Utah and Omaha beaches, the G2 intelligence officer explained, pointing to the map. If they succeed, they could isolate our forces and push us back to the coast in segments. Where will they hit? Jimmy asked. Best guess, along this road network. The officer traced a line through a small village called Carentan. It's the key junction between the 2 beachheads. Jimmy studied the map, noting the terrain features. More bocage country with limited fields of fire and restricted movement for tanks. Not ideal for the American preference for mobility and coordinated attacks. The 751st will hold this sector, the divisional commander ordered, pointing to an approach from the southwest. Work with the 101st Airborne. They're already in the area. Stop that German armor before it reaches Carentan. Jimmy acknowledged the order and returned to his battalion command post to brief his officers. The situation was clear but challenging. Their battalion of Shermans, armed with a standard 75 mm gun, would face Panthers with their long-barreled 75 mm KDK-42 and frontal armor nearly impervious to American tank rounds. "We can't take them head-on," Jimmy explained to his company commanders. "We'll use the terrain to force them into engagement areas of our choosing, flank shots only, and we'll coordinate with the artillery and air support to even the odds." Captain Green raised the question everyone was thinking. "What about the 76 mm guns we were promised? Any word on when they'll arrive?" Jimmy shook his head. "Not in time for this fight. We use what we have." Throughout that night, the 751st prepared its positions. Jimmy worked closely with officers from the 101st Airborne to develop an integrated defense. The paratroopers would provide anti-tank teams and infantry support, while the Shermans would form the heavy-hitting power of the defense. By dawn, they were ready. Jimmy had positioned his companies carefully, with interlocking fields of fire covering likely German approaches. Baker Company was placed in a reserve position, ready to counterattack or reinforce as needed. The morning passed tensely, with scattered reports of German reconnaissance elements probing the American lines. Around noon, the distant rumble of heavy engines announced the arrival of German armor. "Contact Grid Square Baker 9, the radio crackled. "German armor, moving in column. Count 5 Panthers, supporting infantry." Jimmy acknowledged the report and gave rapid orders. The trap was set. Now they would see if it worked against the fearsome German tanks. The lead Panther entered the engagement area 17 hours. Jimmy, observing from a concealed position on high ground, watched through his binoculars as the massive tank moved cautiously along the narrow road, its long guns scanning for targets. "Hold fire," he ordered over the radio. "Let them commit." More Panthers appeared, followed by half-tracks carrying infantry. The German formation was well organized but constrained by the terrain, unable to deploy to full advantage. When the 4th Panther had entered the engagement area, Jimmy gave the order. "All units, fire!" The carefully positioned Shermans opened fire simultaneously. Their target was not the Panthers' heavily armored fronts, but their more vulnerable sides and rear armor, exposed due to the road's configuration. At the same time, artillery crashed down on the German infantry, preventing them from deploying to protect their tanks. The lead Panther took 2 hits in its flank, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. The second managed to traverse its turret, but was hit by concentrated fire before it could locate its attackers. The 3rd and 4th Panthers accelerated, seeking to escape the ambush or find firing positions. Jimmy directed the battle from his command post, repositioning units as the situation evolved. The Germans, recovering from their initial surprise, began to fight back effectively. A Sherman from Charlie Company erupted in flames, hit by a Panther round that penetrated its frontal armor with contemptuous ease. Baker Company moved to position Delta, Jimmy ordered, cut off their retreat route. The battle devolved into a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the hedgerows. The Shermans had the advantage of prepared positions and local knowledge. The Panthers had the advantage of superior armament and armor. It was a close match. By late afternoon, the outcome hung in the balance. The 751st had destroyed 3 Panthers, but lost 6 Shermans. The remaining German tanks had pulled back, but were regrouping for another push. Jimmy knew he needed to end this decisively before darkness fell. "All companies, prepare for coordinated assault," he ordered. "We hit them from 3 sides simultaneously." It was a risky move, giving up some of their defensive advantage. But Jimmy calculated that the Germans, already disoriented and damaged, would break under a determined attack. He was right. As the Shermans advanced from multiple directions, supported by the 101st Infantry, the German force began to disintegrate. The last Panther attempted to withdraw, but became stuck, trying to cross a drainage ditch. Its crew abandoned the vehicle, fleeing on foot. By sunset, the battlefield had quieted. The 751st had lost 8 Shermans and 23 men. But they had destroyed 5 Panthers and inflicted heavy casualties on the German infantry. More importantly, they had stopped the German thrust toward Carentan, helping to secure the vital link between the American beachheads. That night, Jimmy walked among his remaining tanks, speaking with the exhausted crews, commending their performance. The victory had been costly but essential, and it had validated their tactics. The Sherman could defeat superior German armor, but only through maneuver, coordination, and skillful use of terrain. As he returned to his command post, Captain Miller fell in beside him. "Hell of a day, sir." Jimmy nodded, too tired for words. "Engineers found something interesting in that stuck Panther," Miller continued. "New type of armor on the frontal glacis, angled differently than the ones we faced in Africa." Jimmy stopped walking, meaning our rounds would be even less effective than we thought. "Yes, sir. Even the HVA ammunition would struggle against it, except at very close range." Another German improvement, another shifting of the odds. Jimmy felt a familiar frustration rising. The Sherman upgrades were always one step behind German innovations. "We adapt," he said finally. "We learn, and we fight with what we have." He continued toward the command post, his mind already working on new tactics, new approaches. The battle for Normandy was just beginning. There would be more Panthers, more Tigers, more deadly engagements where American tankers would face superior German machines. But today, they had won. Today, the Sherman had proven that with the right tactics and the right men, it could prevail despite its limitations. And that, for now, would have to be enough. Chapter 10, The Human Factor. The weeks following the Normandy invasion saw fierce fighting as the Allies sought to expand their beachhead against determined German resistance. The 751st Tank Battalion was in near constant action, supporting infantry advances, countering German probes, and occasionally engaging enemy armor. By mid-July, the battalion had been reduced to two-thirds of its original strength despite replacements. The human toll was written in the growing list of names Jimmy kept in a small notebook. Men lost under his command, letters he would eventually have to write to their families. Yet amid the losses, there were signs of progress. The Bocage country, initially so favorable to defenders, was being methodically conquered. Engineers had developed rhino devices, steel prongs welded to the front of tanks, that allowed Shermans to punch through the hedgerows instead of having to climb them, reducing their vulnerability. And the promised 76mm gun had finally arrived, with the first upgraded Shermans reaching the battalion in early July. The new gun gave American tankers a fighting chance against Panther frontal armor, though the fearsome Tiger still outclassed them. But the most significant development was less tangible: the growing experience and confidence of the men. The 751st was no longer a fresh unit learning under fire. It had become a battle-hardened formation with proven tactics and procedures. Even new replacements were quickly integrated into a system that maximized the Sherman's strengths and mitigated its weaknesses. One evening, after a day spent supporting an infantry advance that gained barely 1,000 yards of French soil, Jimmy sat with his company commanders in a damaged church that served as their temporary headquarters. Maps were spread across overturned pews, illuminated by lanterns as night fell. "Baker Company lost 2 tanks today," Captain Reynolds reported wearily. "One to a Panzerfaust, one to a Panther. 4 men wounded, 1 killed." Jimmy nodded grimly, making notes. "Charlie Company?" "No losses," Captain Green replied, "but we're down to 7 operational tanks due to mechanical issues. Maintenance is working through the night." The brutal mathematics of attrition. Even successful operations cost them irreplaceable men and machines. Jimmy studied the map, tracing their planned advance for the next day. "Intelligence reports elements of 2nd SS Panzer Division moving into this sector," he said, pointing to a village named St. Lo. "Heavy armor, including Tigers." The officers fell silent, absorbing this news. They had faced Panthers regularly, but had encountered Tigers only rarely in Normandy. "The 76mm won't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor," Captain Winters said finally. "Not unless we're practically touching it." "Then we don't engage from the front," Jimmy replied. "We maneuver, we coordinate, we use artillery and air support. Same tactics that have kept us alive so far." The discussion continued. Plans were refined, contingencies established. Throughout, Jimmy was struck by the quiet competence of these men. They knew the odds, knew the limitations of their equipment, yet remained determined and focused. It was, he realized, the greatest strength of the American tank force. Not its machines, but its people. Later that night, unable to sleep, Jimmy wrote in his journal by the light of a shielded flashlight. "The Sherman remains outgunned and under-armored compared to the best German tanks," he wrote. "Yet we continue to advance while they retreat. The reason isn't technical, but human. Our crews adapt, improvise, and work together. Our logistics keep us supplied and mobile. Our maintenance returns damaged tanks to service within hours rather than days. And our production ensures that every loss is replaced." He paused, reflecting on the men he'd lost and those still under his command. "My father was right," he continued. War isn't about having the best weapons. It's about having the best men. The Sherman isn't the best tank, but the men who crew it are making it sufficient through their courage and ingenuity. That may be cold comfort to those who burn inside its thin armor, but it's the reality of the war we're fighting. He closed the journal and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring more combat, more decisions, more losses. And knowing, too, that regardless of the Sherman's limitations, his battalion would fight on because that's what American tankers did. They adapted. They overcame. They persevered. Morning came with the rumble of distant artillery. The battle for Normandy continued, a grinding campaign of attrition that would eventually lead to the breakout at Saint-Lô and the dash across France. The 751st would be part of that advance, their Shermans racing eastward as the German defenses crumbled. But that was still in the future. For now, Major James Mitchell prepared to lead his men into another day of combat, another test of American armor against German steel, another chapter in the ongoing story of the Sherman tank and the men who fought in it. They were, he knew, writing that story not in technical specifications or production statistics, but in courage, adaptability, and sacrifice. And in that sense, despite its flaws, the Sherman was indeed becoming the right tank for this war. Not because of how it was built, but because of how it was used by the extraordinary, ordinary men who called it home. And that, perhaps, was the true code of the Sherman, not a design philosophy or a tactical doctrine, but a human spirit that refused to be limited by the machine's constraints, a spirit that would, in the end, prove more powerful than German armor, more resilient than German engineering, and more decisive than any single battle. The code of the American tanker, the code Jimmy had helped to forge and now lived by every day on the battlefields of Europe. The code that would, despite all odds, lead them to victory. August 1944. The green hedgerows of Normandy gave way to open fields as the Allied forces finally broke through German defenses. After weeks of brutal fighting in the Bocage country, the moment Major Jimmy Mitchell had been waiting for arrived. Open ground where the mobility and numbers of American armor could be fully exploited. The 751st Tank Battalion rolled eastward as part of the larger American advance, engines roaring in the summer heat. Jimmy stood in the turret of his command Sherman, dust coating his face as he surveyed the countryside through binoculars. Fields of wheat rippled in the breeze, occasionally interrupted by small villages and woodlots that could hide German ambushes. "Beautiful country," Captain Miller remarked from the tank beside Jimmy's. "Shame we had to tear it up." Jimmy nodded. The Norman landscape bore the scars of war. Shell craters pockmarked the fields. Buildings stood roofless and charred. Abandoned equipment littered the roadside. Yet compared to the claustrophobic confines of the hedgerow country, this open terrain felt liberating. "Gives us room to maneuver," Jimmy replied, "and the Germans nowhere to hide." The German forces were in retreat, though far from defeated. Intelligence reports indicated elements of the 21st Panzer Division were attempting to establish defensive positions around a town called Falaise. If the Allies could encircle them there, a significant portion of the German 7th Army would be trapped. "All companies maintain advance," Jimmy ordered over the radio. "Objective Falaise. Watch for stragglers and rear guards." The 751st had been transformed by its experiences in Normandy. It was now a veteran unit with battle-tested procedures and a quiet confidence born of successful engagements. The battalion had received replacement tanks and crews, including more of the improved Shermans with 76mm guns. Nearly half the battalion now sported the longer-barreled weapon, giving them a better chance against German armor. Around noon, scouts reported a German column retreating along a parallel road 2 miles to the north. Jimmy studied his map, seeing an opportunity. "Baker and Charlie companies, continue on current heading," he ordered. "Able company, follow me. We're going to cut across country and intercept that German column." Jimmy's command tank and Able company's 15 Shermans peeled off, crossing fields at top speed. This was what the Sherman was built for: rapid exploitation, using mobility rather than firepower or armor to gain advantage. They reached a ridgeline overlooking the German column just as it came into view. Below them, a mixed force of German vehicles struggled eastward, trucks loaded with infantry, a few half-tracks, and at the rear, 3 Panzer IVs, providing cover. "Engage at will," Jimmy ordered. "Priority on the Panzers." The Shermans opened fire from their commanding position. The German column, caught in the open without cover, erupted in chaos. Trucks swerved off the road or collided as drivers sought escape. Infantry leaped from vehicles, seeking shelter in roadside ditches. The three panzers turned to face the threat, their turrets rotating to bring guns to bear. But they were outnumbered 5-1, caught in a disadvantageous position. Two of the panzers were knocked out in the first minute of the engagement. The third managed to fire twice, shells falling short of the American position, before a 76mm round penetrated its turret. Smoke billowed from the hatches as the crew attempted to escape. The remainder of the German column surrendered or fled on foot. It was a perfect ambush, the kind of engagement where American mobility and numbers could be used to maximum effect. As Jimmy supervised the collection of prisoners and the securing of captured equipment, he reflected on the changing nature of the campaign. The Germans were still dangerous, still possessed superior tanks, but they were losing the strategic initiative. Fuel shortages limited their mobility, air superiority prevented daylight movement of reinforcements, and their once vaunted panzer divisions were being whittled down by constant combat. The Sherman, despite its limitations, was proving to be the right tank for this phase of the war. Its reliability allowed for rapid advances without the mechanical breakdowns that plagued German armor. Its standardized design meant damaged tanks could be quickly repaired using interchangeable parts. And its fuel efficiency gave American forces operational reach that the Germans could no longer match. That evening, as the battalion established its lager for the night, Jimmy received new orders from division. The 751st was to support an infantry advance toward Argenton, the southern jaw of what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. "We're going to trap the bastards," the division operations officer explained over the radio. "Cut off their escape route to the east. Your tanks will be the hammer. The British and Canadians coming down from the north will be the anvil." Jimmy acknowledged the orders and gathered his company commanders for a briefing. As they studied the maps in the fading daylight, the magnitude of the opportunity became clear. If successful, this operation could destroy a significant portion of the German forces in Normandy. "Speed is essential," Jimmy emphasized. "The faster we close the gap, the more Germans we trap." The battalion resumed its advance at first light, pushing hard toward Argenton. They encountered scattered resistance, the occasional anti-tank gun, small groups of infantry with Panzerfausts, but nothing that could significantly delay their progress. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the outskirts of Argenton. From a hilltop observation post, Jimmy could see German columns streaming eastward, trying to escape the closing trap. The air buzzed with Allied fighter bombers swooping down to strafe the retreating enemy. "We've got them," Captain Green exulted, watching the scene through his binoculars, like shooting fish in a barrel. Jimmy nodded, but his expression remained grave. "They're still dangerous. Cornered animals fight hardest." His caution proved warranted when, an hour later, a counterattack materialized from the northeast. A mixed force of Panthers and infantry hit Charlie Company's position, temporarily breaking through the American line. Jimmy rushed reinforcements to the threatened sector, personally directing the defense from his command tank. The fighting was intense, with German and American forces often engaged at point-blank range. "Target 2 o'clock, Panther, 800 yards, his gunner reported. "Identified," Jimmy confirmed. HVAP round. The Sherman's 76mm gun roared, the special tungsten cord shell streaking toward the Panther. At this range, against the Panther's side armor, the round penetrated. The German tank slewed to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. But the Germans weren't finished. Two more Panthers appeared on the flank, their long 75mm guns seeking targets. A Sherman from Baker Company erupted in flames, hit squarely in the turret. Jimmy ordered his driver to reverse into cover behind a stone farmhouse, then directed artillery fire onto the German position. Within minutes, white phosphorus shells burst among the advancing Panthers, obscuring their vision and forcing them to halt. "All companies, converge on grid reference Baker 7, Jimmy ordered. "Hit them from 3 sides while they're blind." The counterattack worked. Caught in the open, unable to see clearly through the smoke, the German force was systematically reduced by the coordinated American response. By sunset, the threat had been eliminated, though at a cost of 4 Shermans and 11 casualties. That night, as his men secured their positions around Argenton, Jimmy received word that the trap was nearly closed. Only a narrow corridor remained open between Falaise and Argenton, and that gap was under constant artillery fire and air attack. "We've got them," The division commander's voice crackled over the radio. Hold your positions. Let them break themselves against us. For the next 3 days, the 751st helped maintain the southern shoulder of the Falaise pocket as the Germans made increasingly desperate attempts to break out. The fighting was brutal, but one-sided. Without air cover, low on fuel and ammunition, the once mighty German formations disintegrated under relentless Allied pressure. By August 21st, it was over. The Falaise pocket had been closed and then systematically reduced. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered. Thousands more lay dead among the wreckage of their equipment. Jimmy toured the battlefield with Captain Miller once it was secured. The scene defied description. For miles, the roads and fields were littered with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, abandoned weapons, and the bodies of German soldiers. The smell of death hung heavy in the summer air. Jesus, Miller murmured, looking out over the devastation. What a meat grinder. Jimmy nodded grimly. This was the reality of modern war, not glory but industrial-scale destruction. And yet, amid the horror, there was a sense of accomplishment. The German 7th Army had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The road to Paris lay open. As they returned to the battalion command post, Jimmy received new orders. The 751st would join the advance toward the Seine River, part of the rush to liberate Paris. After weeks of brutal combat in Normandy, they would be among the first American units to enter the French capital. Spread the word, Jimmy told his company commanders. We're heading for Paris. The men's exhaustion seemed to lift at the news. Paris represented not just a military objective, but a symbol of culture, of civilization, of what they were fighting to liberate. After the slaughter of the Falaise pocket, they needed such a symbol. 2 days later, the 751st Tank Battalion rolled down the Champs-Élysées, part of the Allied forces liberating Paris. Crowds lined the streets, cheering wildly, throwing flowers onto the tanks. Women rushed forward to kiss the American tankers. Children clambered onto the Shermans, wide-eyed with excitement. Jimmy, standing in his turret, was overwhelmed by the reception. After months of death and destruction, this outpouring of joy and gratitude seemed almost unreal. He watched his men, grimy, exhausted, but suddenly grinning like schoolboys, accept the adulation of the crowd. For a few hours, they could forget the comrades lost, the limitations of their tanks, the battles still to come. For a few hours, they could simply be liberators, welcomed by a grateful people. But the war wasn't over. Even as Paris celebrated, German forces were regrouping to the east. The 751st would have only a brief respite before returning to combat, pushing toward the German border and the battles that awaited there. Chapter 12. Winter of Trials. By December 1944, the war had changed again. The rapid advance across France had slowed as Allied forces approached the German border. Supply lines were stretched thin, autumn rains turned roads to mud, and the Germans fought with increasing desperation as the battle moved closer to their homeland. The 751st Tank Battalion, now under Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, following a well-deserved promotion, had been in near-continuous combat for 6 months. The unit had received periodic replacements of men and machines, but the corps of veteran officers and NCOs who had landed in Normandy was dwindling. Combat, accidents, disease, and simple exhaustion had taken their toll. Jimmy felt the strain as he reviewed the battalion's status reports in a commandeered Belgian farmhouse. Outside, snow fell steadily, adding to the challenges they faced. The Sherman's narrow tracks performed poorly in snow and mud compared to the wider tracks of German tanks. Fuel situation? Jimmy asked Captain Miller, who had remained his XO despite opportunities for his own command. Critical, Miller replied, consulting his clipboard. Enough for local operations, but not for any major advance. Supply trucks are stuck 50 miles back due to weather. Jimmy nodded, unsurprised. The logistics challenges were affecting all Allied units. Ammunition? Better. We received a shipment yesterday, full loadout for all operational tanks. And how many are operational? Miller hesitated. 31 out of authorized 45. Maintenance is working around the clock, but cold weather is causing problems with engines and lubrication. 2/3 strength, Jimmy calculated. Not ideal, but better than many battalions along the front. The 751st had been pulled into reserve near the Belgian town of Bastogne, part of a general reorganization of forces before the planned push into Germany. The relative quiet of the reserve position had been welcome after months of combat. It allowed for maintenance, training of replacements, and some much-needed rest for the veterans. But Jimmy remained uneasy. The Germans had been quiet for weeks, too quiet for his comfort. Latest intelligence? He asked, moving to the map table where the known German positions were marked. Miller shook his head. Nothing significant. Same picture for the past 2 weeks. Germans dug in along the Siegfried Line, limited patrol activity. Jimmy studied the map, particularly the densely forested area of the Ardennes that lay before them. The High Command considered this sector quiet, unlikely to see major action due to terrain unsuitable for armored operations. They thought the same thing in 1950, Jimmy murmured, recalling how German panzer divisions had punched through this very forest to shatter French defenses, and the Germans proved them wrong. His concerns were dismissed by higher headquarters when he raised them. The Germans lacked the fuel, equipment, and manpower for a major offensive, he was told. The Ardennes was a quiet sector where battered divisions could rest and refit. 4 days later, on December 16th, Jimmy was awakened before dawn by an urgent call from division headquarters. The Germans had launched a massive offensive along a 50-mile front in the Ardennes. Hundreds of tanks, supported by infantry, had smashed through the thinly held American lines. The 751st was ordered to move immediately to reinforce threatened sectors. Within an hour, the battalion was on the move, Sherman engines struggling in the bitter cold as they headed toward the sound of distant artillery. Snow reduced visibility, and the roads were clogged with American troops retreating from the initial German onslaught. Reports are fragmented, Jimmy told his company commanders over the radio, but it appears to be a full-scale offensive with at least 2 panzer divisions. They've broken through in several sectors and are driving west. Objective? Captain Green asked. Unclear. Possibly Antwerp to split the Allied forces. Our immediate mission is to establish blocking positions along this ridgeline. Jimmy indicated the location on their maps. Delay the German advance until reinforcements arrive. They reached their assigned position by mid-afternoon, just as the leading elements of the German advance appeared on the road below them. Through his binoculars, Jimmy identified a column of Panther tanks followed by infantry in half-tracks, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, according to their markings. All companies engage at maximum effective range, Jimmy ordered. Priority targets are the lead vehicles. Block the road. The battalion's guns spoke in near unison, shells arcing down onto the German column. The lead Panther erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that blocked the narrow forest road. Other German tanks attempted to maneuver off the road, but found themselves constrained by the dense forest and steep embankments. The Germans returned fire, their 75mm and 88mm shells slamming into the American positions. 2 Shermans from Able Company were hit and destroyed, their crews bailing out into the snow. But the 751st position on the ridgeline gave them a significant advantage, allowing them to fire down on the less protected top armor of the German tanks. For an hour, the battle raged, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Germans couldn't advance up the narrow roads without exposing themselves to devastating fire. The Americans couldn't descend to finish off the German force without losing their terrain advantage. As darkness fell, the fighting subsided. The temperature dropped precipitously, reaching well below freezing. Inside his command tank, Jimmy huddled with his crew, the engine running periodically to provide heat. Radio reports throughout the night painted a grim picture. The German offensive was gaining ground across a broad front. American units were surrounded, cut off, retreating in disarray. They really caught us with our pants down, Miller observed as they listened to the reports. Biggest intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. Jimmy nodded grimly. The overconfidence of the high command had allowed the Germans to achieve complete surprise. Now they were paying for that mistake in American lives. Dawn revealed a transformed battlefield. The German column had withdrawn during the night, leaving their destroyed vehicles behind. But new reports indicated they had simply found another route west, bypassing the 751st blocking position. Orders from division, the radio operator announced, were to fall back to Bastogne. The town is being surrounded. They need armor support. Jimmy acknowledged the orders, understanding their significance. Bastogne was a critical road junction. If the Germans took it, their advance toward the Meuse River would be greatly accelerated. The battalion moved out, traveling cross-country where possible to avoid the main roads now dominated by German forces. They reached Bastogne by nightfall, finding the town in the early stages of a siege. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division were establishing a perimeter defense, preparing for the German forces closing in from all sides. Jimmy reported to the acting commander of the 101st, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, in the town's command post. "Damn glad to see you, Colonel," McAuliffe said, shaking Jimmy's hand. "How many tanks did you bring me?" 31 operational, sir, but we're low on fuel." McAuliffe nodded, turning to the map. "You'll have to make it last. We're surrounded and air resupply is uncertain given the weather. I need your tanks distributed along the perimeter, with emphasis on these road junctions." He pointed to several spots on the map. "That's where they'll try to break through." Jimmy studied the defensive perimeter, noting its circular shape, roughly 6 miles in diameter. "We'll need to maintain a mobile reserve, sir. The Germans will probe, find a weak spot, then concentrate." "Agreed. Keep a company in reserve, the rest integrated with our infantry positions." As Jimmy left to implement the defensive plan, McAuliffe called after him. "Colonel Mitchell, we're going to hold this town, no matter what." Jimmy nodded. "Yes, sir, no matter what." Over the next week, the 751st played a crucial role in the defense of Bastogne. The Sherman's 75mm and 70-60mm guns proved effective against the German infantry and lighter vehicles that probed the perimeter. When Panthers or Tigers appeared, the tankers relied on their hard-learned tactics, flank shots, coordination with infantry, anti-tank weapons, and carefully conserving ammunition for the highest probability shots. The winter weather, initially a challenge for the American forces, increasingly became an ally. German tanks, like the Americans, struggled in the snow and ice, but the Germans lacked the maintenance support and spare parts to keep their complex machines running in these conditions. Each day, more German tanks were immobilized by mechanical failures than by enemy action. Fuel became the critical constraint for both sides. The Germans had launched their offensive with limited fuel reserves, counting on capturing American supplies to continue their advance. The Americans in Bastogne were cut off from their normal supply lines, forced to carefully ration their remaining fuel. "We're down to our last 10 gallons per tank," Captain Miller reported on the 5th day of the siege. "Enough for about an hour of operation at most." Jimmy nodded, understanding the implications. "Keep 5 tanks running at all times, minimum power, rotate every 2 hours to distribute the fuel consumption. The rest shut down completely but maintain combat readiness." The fuel conservation measures allowed the 751st to maintain a minimal mobile reserve, crucial for responding to German breakthroughs. But it meant most of the battalion's tanks were essentially immobile pillboxes, their usefulness severely constrained. On December 22nd, German emissaries approached the American lines under a flag of truce, delivering a surrender ultimatum. McAuliffe's famous response, "Nuts," spread through the defensive perimeter, boosting morale despite the increasingly desperate situation. "What does it mean, nuts?" a replacement tanker asked Jimmy after hearing the general's reply. Jimmy smiled. "It means we're staying, and they can go to hell." The next day brought both the heaviest German attack yet and the first break in the weather. With clear skies, illustrated aircraft appeared overhead, strafing German positions and dropping vital supplies by parachute. Jimmy directed his mobile reserve to counter a major push from the southeast, where German infantry, supported by several Panthers, had broken through the outer defenses. The engagement was brutal, fought at close quarters in the ruins of Belgian farmhouses. "Target, Panther, 100 yards, his gunner shouted. "Fire," Jimmy ordered. The Sherman's 76mm gun thundered, the shell striking the Panther at almost point-blank range. At this distance, even the Panther's frontal armor couldn't withstand the impact. The German tank slewed sideways, smoke pouring from its hatches. But another Panther, concealed behind a stone barn, opened fire. The shell struck Jimmy Sherman on the turret ring, the impact throwing him against the inside wall. His head slammed into a protruding bracket, momentarily stunning him. Through a haze of pain, he heard his crew reacting. The driver reversed, seeking cover. The gunner traversed the turret, trying to acquire the second Panther. The loader slammed another round into the breach. Blood trickled into Jimmy's eyes from a gash on his forehead. He wiped it away, forcing himself to focus. "Position?" he demanded. "Behind the barn, 10 o'clock, his gunner replied. "Forward 5 yards?" Jimmy ordered the driver. Just enough to get a shot. The Sherman edged forward. The second Panther came into view, its turrets still oriented toward their previous position. The gunner didn't waste the opportunity. The 76mm gun fired, the shell striking the Panther's flank. A secondary explosion followed as ammunition inside the German tank detonated. The remaining German infantry retreated, leaving their destroyed tanks behind. Jimmy ordered his driver to return to the American lines, where a medic dressed the cut on his forehead. "That'll need stitches, sir," the medic advised. "Should go to the aid station." Jimmy shook his head. Later, we're still in a fight. The battle for Bastogne continued for 3 more days. Then on December 26th, lead elements of Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement from the south, ending the siege. The 751st, down to 12 operational tanks and critically low on fuel and ammunition, had held their sectors against repeated German attacks. As the relief forces poured into Bastogne, Jimmy gathered his company commanders in a damaged church that had served as their command post during the siege. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and the cold, "you've done the impossible. Held against superior forces, in the worst conditions, with minimal supplies." The officers, as tired and dirty as their commander, nodded in acknowledgement. "But the fight isn't over," Jimmy continued. "The Germans have been stopped, but not defeated. We'll refit, refuel, and get back into the battle." Later, as medics finally stitched the wound on his forehead, Jimmy reflected on what the battalion had accomplished. The Sherman, despite all its limitations, had proven itself again in the crucible of combat. Not because it was the best tank on the battlefield, it still wasn't, but because of the men who crewed it and the system that supported it. Even in the depths of winter, cut off from supplies, American maintenance teams had kept Shermans running when German tanks failed. American crews had adapted to fuel shortages, developing rotation systems that the more rigid German command structure wouldn't have allowed. And American tactics had evolved to maximize the Sherman's strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Ardennes Offensive came to be known, was Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. For the 751st Tank Battalion, it had been their greatest test and their finest hour. They had bent but not broken. They had suffered losses but inflicted greater ones on the enemy. And they had proven, once again, that in the right hands, the Sherman could stand against the best German armor. Chapter 13, The Final Drive. March 1945. The Allied armies poised on the west bank of the Rhine, preparing for the final drive into the German heartland. After defeating the Ardennes offensive, American forces had pushed the Germans back to their original positions and beyond, reclaiming all the ground lost in December. The 751st Tank Battalion, now at full strength again after receiving replacements of both men and machines, occupied assembly areas near the German city of Remagen. The unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge had given the Allies a crucial crossing point over the Rhine, and forces were streaming across to establish a bridgehead on the east bank. Colonel Jimmy Mitchell, recovered from his Bastogne wounds, but noticeably thinner and more gray at the temples, briefed his officers in a captured German schoolhouse. Maps showing the planned advance were tacked to the blackboard. "We cross tomorrow at X100, he explained. "Third wave following the 394th Infantry. Our objective is to break out of the bridgehead and drive eastward toward Frankfurt." The terrain beyond the Rhine was more open than the forests and bocage they had fought through in Belgium and France. Better ground for tanks, but also less cover from German anti-tank weapons and the remaining Luftwaffe. "Intelligence reports the Germans are forming a defensive line approximately 15 miles east of the river," Jimmy continued. "Mixed forces, including elements of several Panzer divisions. They're scraping together whatever they can to slow us down." Captain Miller, still serving faithfully as Jimmy's XO despite multiple opportunities for his own command, raised a pertinent question. "What about the new German tanks? Any word on King Tigers or Jag Tigers in our sector?" Jimmy nodded, appreciating Miller's focus on the most dangerous threats. "Limited numbers only. The Germans are running out of fuel and train crews faster than tanks, but those they have are still deadly. The King Tiger's 88mm gun can penetrate our armor at ranges up to 2,500 yards. We'll need to be especially vigilant." The briefing continued, covering coordination with artillery, air support, and the infantry they would be working with. By now, these procedures were second nature to the veteran battalion. The 751st had developed a reputation for effective combined arms operations, making them a preferred armored unit for infantry commanders to work with. As the officers filed out to brief their own men, Jimmy felt a familiar mix of emotions before a major operation: determination, concern for his men, and a cold calculation of the risks they faced. The Germans were on the defensive now, their strategic situation hopeless, but that only made them more dangerous in tactical engagements. Cornered animals fought the hardest. Dawn the next day brought clear skies and the promise of air support. The 751st crossed the Rhine on pontoon bridges constructed by Army engineers, the original Ludendorff Bridge having collapsed a week earlier. On the east bank, they joined their assigned infantry regiment and began the push eastward. The first day went better than expected. German resistance was scattered and uncoordinated, suggesting that the chaos of retreat had disrupted their defensive preparations. The battalion advanced nearly 12 miles by nightfall, stopping only when darkness made further progress too risky. As they established their night lager, Captain Green of Charlie Company brought Jimmy a captured German officer for interrogation. The man, a lieutenant from 2nd SS Panzer Division, was wounded in the arm but maintaining the rigid posture of a professional soldier. Through an interpreter, Jimmy questioned him about German defensive positions ahead. The officer refused to provide specifics, but did offer one significant piece of information, perhaps because he knew the war was effectively over. "The Fuhrer has ordered all forces to converge on Berlin," he said through the interpreter. "The reserves that were to stop you here have been redirected north." If true, this suggested the path to Frankfurt might be less heavily defended than intelligence had indicated. Jimmy ordered reconnaissance patrols to verify, but adjusted the next day's plans to take advantage of the potential opportunity. The second day brought them into contact with the main German defensive line, which proved to be less formidable than feared. A mixed force of infantry with limited armor support put up determined resistance, but lacked the strength to truly halt the American advance. By mid-afternoon, the 751st had broken through, creating a gap that following units quickly exploited. The advance became a pursuit as German forces retreated eastward, attempting to establish new defensive positions. It was during this pursuit that they encountered one of the fearsome King Tigers. The massive tank, weighing nearly 70 tons, was positioned on a hillside overlooking a crucial crossroads. Its 88mm gun had already knocked out 2 Shermans from Baker Company before they even spotted it. "All companies, halt and take cover," Jimmy ordered over the radio. "King Tiger at grid reference Charlie 5. Infantry, deploy smoke screen." The attached infantry moved quickly, popping smoke grenades to obscure the King Tiger's line of sight. The massive German tank fired blindly into the smoke, its shells screaming overhead. Jimmy studied the terrain, looking for a way to outflank the behemoth. Its frontal armor was effectively impervious to anything the Shermans could throw at it, but its sides and rear were more vulnerable. "Baker Company, maintain position and keep his attention," Jimmy ordered. "Abel and Charlie, follow me. We're going to circle around through that draw to the north." Leading 2 companies of Shermans, Jimmy executed a wide flanking maneuver, using the terrain to remain out of the King Tiger's line of sight. The movement took nearly an hour, but eventually positioned them on the German tank's flank. "Fire only on my command," Jimmy instructed as they crept into position. "Aim for the engine compartment or the tracks." When they were within 600 yards, still undetected by the German crew who remained focused on Baker Company's position, Jimmy gave the order. 10 Shermans fired almost simultaneously, their 76mm shells streaking toward the King Tiger. Several rounds bounced off, even against the thinner side armor, but 2 found vulnerable spots, one penetrating the engine compartment, another damaging the right track assembly. The massive tank tried to traverse its turret to face the new threat, but the damaged track prevented it from completing the movement. 2 more volleys from the American tanks left the King Tiger a burning hulk. Its crew attempted to escape, but were cut down by machine gun fire from the advancing infantry. The engagement was a testament to the evolution of American armored tactics. The King Tiger was technologically superior in almost every respect. Better gun, better armor, better optics. But the 751st had used mobility, coordination, and numbers to defeat it, exploiting the German tank's weaknesses while minimizing exposure to its strengths. The advance continued eastward, with the 751st often at the spearhead. German resistance became increasingly disorganized, though small units continued to fight with determination. Fuel shortages further hampered German mobility, leading to the abandonment of tanks and heavy equipment that couldn't be moved. In mid-April, the 751st reached the outskirts of Frankfurt. The industrial city had been heavily bombed by Allied air forces, leaving much of it in ruins. German forces prepared to defend it house by house, street by street. Jimmy received new orders before the urban battle began. The 751st was to bypass Frankfurt, leaving its reduction to following infantry units. They would continue eastward toward the city of Erfurt, part of the general American drive into central Germany. This suited Jimmy perfectly. Urban combat was the worst environment for tanks, negating their mobility and making them vulnerable to infantry anti-tank weapons fired from buildings. Better to keep moving, maintaining the momentum of the advance. As they approached Erfurt, a radio message arrived from division headquarters. Jimmy was ordered to report immediately for reassignment. A staff car arrived to transport him to the rear, leaving Captain Miller temporarily in command of the battalion. "What's this about?" Jimmy asked the staff officer who had delivered the orders. "Can't say for sure, sir," the captain replied. "But word is they're forming a special task force for the final drive to the east, selecting officers with both combat experience and technical expertise." At division headquarters, Jimmy found himself in a room with several other battalion commanders, all with similar backgrounds, combat experience combined with technical knowledge of American armor. The briefing officer, a full colonel from Patton's staff, laid out the situation. "Gentlemen, we're establishing a special armored task force for the final phase of operations. Intelligence indicates the Russians will reach Berlin before we do. The general wants to secure as much German territory as possible before the meeting, for post-war considerations." Maps displayed the plan thrust eastward, deep into territory that had originally been designated for the Russian zone of occupation. "Your units have been selected for their combat effectiveness and maintenance discipline. This will be a rapid advance with minimal logistical support. You'll need to keep your vehicles running on whatever you can scrounge." Jimmy studied the maps, noting the ambitious objectives. "Any special resistance expected?" The colonel nodded. "The Germans are concentrating their remaining heavy armor to protect routes to Berlin. You may encounter Tiger IIs and Jog Tigers. Additionally, there are reports of new experimental vehicles being rushed from development facilities to the front. New German tanks. Always new German tanks, each more formidable than the last." Yet the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. These would be the final battles, the last desperate stands of a defeated regime. Jimmy returned to the 751st with their new orders. The battalion would join Task Force Lightning, a mixed armored force that would drive eastward as fast as fuel and maintenance would allow. Their ultimate objective, the Elbe River, the agreed demarcation line with Soviet forces. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of rapid movement, occasional sharp engagements, and constant push eastward. The German military was disintegrating, with some units fighting fanatically while others surrendered en masse. Civilians fled westward, clogging roads and complicating the advance. True to intelligence predictions, they encountered several of Germany's most advanced tanks. A Jagd Tiger, essentially a massive tank destroyer mounting a 128mm gun, ambushed them near a small town whose name few could pronounce. The behemoth destroyed 3 Shermans before concentrated artillery fire and flanking maneuvers by the remaining tanks neutralized it. What struck Jimmy most during these engagements was the contrast between German and American approaches to tank warfare. The German vehicles were technological marvels. The Jagd Tiger's gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor at ranges exceeding 2 miles. But they were too few, too complex, too difficult to maintain, and by this stage of the war often crewed by hastily trained men who couldn't exploit their capabilities. The Sherman, for all its limitations, had proven itself the right tank for this war. Reliable, maintainable, and available in overwhelming numbers, it had helped carry Allied forces from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. Not the best tank, perhaps, but the most practical one. On April 25, 1945, elements of the 751st Tank Battalion reached the Elbe River near the town of Torgau. To their surprise, Soviet forces were already there. The planned meeting of Allied forces from east and west had occurred. Jimmy watched from the turret of his command tank as American and Russian soldiers embraced, exchanged souvenirs, and celebrated the imminent end of the European war. His thoughts turned to the long journey that had brought him here, from the testing grounds at Aberdeen to the battlefields of North Africa, Normandy, the Ardennes, and finally the German heartland. The Sherman tank had been his constant companion throughout, evolving from the flawed original model to the improved versions with wet stowage and 76mm guns. It had never been the perfect weapon, but in the hands of well-trained, adaptable crews, it had proven good enough. 2 weeks later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The 751st Tank Battalion gathered for a formal ceremony, recognition of their achievements and sacrifices. Of the original contingent that had landed in Normandy, less than 30% remained. The others had been killed, wounded, captured, or rotated home. As he addressed his men for what might be the last time, Jimmy Mitchell felt an overwhelming pride mixed with solemn recognition of the cost. You've written history with steel tracks and determination, he told them. When faced with superior enemy technology, you adapted. When faced with impossible conditions, you persevered. When faced with devastating losses, you continued the advance. The men listened silently, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of victory: pride in achievement, relief at survival, grief for lost comrades. The Sherman wasn't the best tank on the battlefield, Jimmy continued, voicing what they all knew. But you were the best men, and in the end that made all the difference. Chapter 14, Legacy. Arlington National Cemetery, 1975. 30 years after the end of the war in Europe. The old soldier stood before a section of graves, his once dark hair now silver, his tall frame slightly stooped with age. James Mitchell, retired colonel, wore his uniform with decorations for this special occasion, the 30th anniversary of VE Day. Around him gathered other veterans of the 751st, fewer each year as age and illness claimed them. They had come to honor their fallen comrades and to remember their shared experience, the crucible of combat that had formed bonds stronger than time could erode. Hard to believe it's been 30 years, said a familiar voice beside him. Jimmy turned to see Frank Miller, his hair thinned, but his eyes still sharp with intelligence. The former captain, Nearsarm, now a successful engineering executive, had remained a close friend through the decades. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, Jimmy replied. Other times, like another lifetime entirely. They walked slowly among the gravestones, pausing occasionally to place a small American flag or render a salute. So many of their comrades rested here, their lives cut short in those desperate battles across Europe. Did you hear about the ceremony at Aberdeen tomorrow? Miller asked. They're dedicating a new exhibit on tank development. The Sherman has a place of honor. Jimmy nodded. He had been invited to speak but had declined. His relationship with the Sherman remained complicated. Pride in what they had accomplished with it, frustration at its limitations, grief for the men lost because of them. The Russians still claim their T-34 was the best tank of the war, Miller continued, a hint of the old rivalry in his voice. The Germans would argue for the Panther, Jimmy countered, the British for the Comet. And what would you say, Colonel, after all these years? Jimmy considered the question carefully, as he had many times before. I'd say there is no best tank, only the right tank for specific circumstances. The Sherman was right for America's situation, our industrial capacity, our logistics, our manpower. They continued walking, their conversation turning to memories both painful and proud. The desperate defense of Bastogne, the breakout from Normandy, the crossing of the Rhine, and always the Sherman at the center of it all, the vehicle that had carried them across a continent at war. As they completed their circuit of the cemetery, a young Army officer approached them, saluting crisply. Colonel Mitchell, I am Captain Weber. My grandfather fought in the war on the German side. Jimmy returned the salute, studying the young man with interest. Weber, from the 2nd SS Panzer Division? The captain looked surprised. Yes, sir, he commanded a Tiger tank. He told me stories about facing American Shermans. He always said they were undergunned and underarmored, but somehow kept coming. Jimmy smiled slightly. We kept coming because we had to, and because we could replace our losses. Your grandfather's Tiger might destroy 5 Shermans, but we had 10 more right behind them. He developed great respect for American tankers, Captain Weber said. Said you did more with less than any other army. The 3 men walked together toward the cemetery exit, the conversation spanning generations and former battle lines. Weber explained that his father had immigrated to America after the war, that he himself had been born in Ohio, that his decision to join the U.S. Army had seemed natural despite his family's history. My grandfather is still alive, living in Munich, he said as they reached the gates. When I told him I was meeting you, he asked me to deliver a message. What message? Jimmy asked. He said to tell you that the better tank didn't win the war. The better men did. Jimmy felt a surge of emotion at hearing his own words echoed back from a former enemy. Your grandfather was right. Give him my regards and my respect for a worthy opponent. As Weber departed, Jimmy and Miller made their way to the waiting staff car. They had one more stop to make, the Smithsonian Institution, where a preserved Sherman tank was on display as part of an exhibition on World War II technology. The museum was crowded with visitors, many of them school children on field trips. Jimmy and Miller stood before the Sherman, its olive drab paint gleaming under the gallery lights, its 76mm gun pointing eternally forward. Looks smaller than I remember, Miller observed. Jimmy nodded. Everything does. A museum docent, recognizing their uniforms and decorations, approached respectfully. Did you gentlemen serve in tanks during the war? 751st Tank Battalion, Jimmy replied, from Normandy to the Elbe. The docent's eyes widened. Would you mind speaking to a group of students? They're studying World War II and to hear from actual veterans. Jimmy hesitated, then agreed. Soon he found himself facing a group of high school students, their faces showing varying degrees of interest and boredom. How could they understand what it had been like? The fear, the camaraderie, the constant presence of death. This tank, he began, gesturing to the Sherman behind him, carried America across Europe. It wasn't the biggest or the strongest. German tanks like the Tiger and Panther could destroy it easily in direct combat, but we had thousands of them, and brave men willing to fight despite the odds. He shared stories of specific engagements, of tactics developed to overcome the Sherman's limitations, of the improvements made throughout the war. The students' attention sharpened as he spoke. The history in their textbooks suddenly connected to a real person with real experiences. The most important lesson I learned, he concluded, was that technology alone doesn't win wars. It's how you use what you have, how you adapt to challenges, and most importantly, the quality and determination of your people. As the students dispersed, a man in a business suit approached. He introduced himself as a representative from the Detroit Arsenal, now developing the next generation of American tanks. Colonel Mitchell, your experience is invaluable to us. The lessons from the Sherman inform our current designs. We're developing a new main battle tank that will finally give American forces the protection and firepower they deserve. Jimmy listened as the man described the prototype that would eventually become the M1 Abrams. Its composite armor, its powerful engine, its sophisticated fire control system. Everything the Sherman had lacked. We've learned from the past, the representative assured him. Never again will American tankers face superior enemy armor with inadequate protection and armament. Jimmy nodded, appreciating the commitment, but recognizing the eternal cycle of military development. Today's superior weapon would be tomorrow's vulnerability, as new technologies and tactics evolve to counter it. Just remember, he told the representative, the best tank is the one that makes it to the battlefield in sufficient numbers, with crews trained to use it effectively, and with the logistical support to keep it fighting. All the armor and firepower in the world won't matter if it breaks down 50 miles from the front. That evening in his hotel room, Jimmy opened a small leather case he had carried throughout the day's events. Inside was the makeshift keychain Sergeant O'Malley had given him in North Africa, now worn smooth by decades of handling. The names engraved on it had faded but remained legible. The first casualties of the 751st, men who had never seen the ultimate victory their sacrifices helped achieve. Next to it lay his father's letter, the paper yellow and fragile with age. He didn't need to read it. The words were permanently engraved in his memory. War isn't about having the best weapons. It's about having the best men. The Sherman, with all its flaws and compromises, had proven his father right. It had been good enough in the hands of men determined to make it work, men willing to adapt and overcome, men whose courage compensated for their machine's deficiencies. As he carefully replaced these mementos in their case, Jimmy reflected on the true legacy of the Sherman tank and the men who fought in it. Not technological superiority, not tactical brilliance, but simply this: they had done what was necessary with what they had available, and in doing so they had helped save a world from tyranny. The Sherman's code, in the end, wasn't about steel and gunnery and horsepower. It was about the human spirit's capacity to transcend limitations, to find paths to victory even when outmatched, to persevere when logic suggested retreat. It was, Jimmy realized, a uniquely American story, a testament to practicality over perfection, to mass production over craftsmanship, to adaptability over rigid doctrine. The Sherman, like America itself, had prevailed not because it was flawless, but because it was good enough in sufficient quantities at the decisive moment. And that perhaps was the greatest legacy of all.